Peter Rollins, philosopher, theologian, and one-time visitor to St. Mark's some years ago, says that there are nothings that are nothing, but there are some nothings that are something, which I know sounds like complete gobbledygook, but let me explain. So imagine in this busy, hectic time you decide, and I hope you do decide, to go and treat yourself. And you go to your favorite coffee shop or your favorite lunch spot, and it's just you, and you're not doing anything, and you're not being productive, but you're just taking care of yourself, maybe enjoying your favorite brew or whatever it is that you like to eat. And you're sitting there in a cafe and at a table, and as cafe tables usually are, you're in a chair, but there's also a chair directly across from you on the other side of the table, and it is empty. What's in the chair? Nothing. Nothing. And you probably don't even notice the chair's there, right? Because you're flipping through your phone, or you're reading a book, or you're just, wistfully looking out the window. Maybe your coat's on the back of the chair, but there's nothing in the chair, but it's nothing. Nothing. But now let's say you're in the same cafe, but instead of a time for you just to go and be by yourself, you've been waiting for the rector for 35 minutes. Some rector, I don't know. And that chair's been empty for 35 minutes, and now your coffee is either gone or cold. And perhaps you're a little perturbed that you've now wasted 35 minutes of your time in this cafe. Perhaps you're angry at 35 minutes, and perhaps you're sad thinking that the rector has completely forgotten about you. What's in the chair? Nothing. But now that nothing is a something. That void is not just empty, but it's filled with sadness, anger, frustration, or something. I think of a happier scenario. Imagine someone sitting in that chair waiting for their crush to come in the door. It's a first date, right? And so every time that door opens up, they're like, is that them? Is that them? And so the chair across from them is empty. There's nothing in the chair, but now that void is filled with expectation and butterflies in the stomach and excitement because your beloved is about to walk through the door. It's a something. It looks like nothing, but it's a something. We are in this holiday time and around the Thanksgiving table and Christmas table in many homes, there are empty chairs that weren't empty last year or the year before. And that void, that emptiness, that empty chair brings an incredible amount, an unbearable amount of grief and sadness, remembering that it was once full of someone that we loved. There are some voids which are just voids, but there are some voids which are heavy with excitement, with frustration, with immense grief. I thought about Peter Rollins and his nothing something when I saw that Malachi was our Old Testament lesson for today. If you read through the Christian Old Testament, Malachi is the last book. It's not true for our Jewish friends and neighbors. They ordered the books of the Old Testament differently, but in the Christian version of the Old Testament, it's the last book. He's considered one of the latter prophets, and one of the features of Malachi is telling his people that there is someone who is coming, and there's someone who's coming that's going to right all wrongs. Sort of like how Isaiah says, we're waiting for someone, every valley shall be filled, every mountain and hill shall be made low, the crooked shall be made straight, the rough ways made smooth. There's wrongs in the world, says Malachi, and there is someone coming who is going to begin to right those wrongs. And we just have to wait. But here's the thing. If you open your Pew Bible and you go to Malachi, it's a short little book, you get to the end of Malachi, you turn the page, and then you end the Old Testament and you begin the New. One of the reasons why we put Malachi at the end. And so you turn the page, and all of a sudden you're in the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew is talking about the coming of this figure that Malachi was talking about. And so it's just one turn of a page. Wait for this figure, you turn the page, and there he is. But here's the thing. In the turn of that page, in the time period between Malachi writing his book of prophecy and Jesus being born in Bethlehem, there was 400 years. It's a quick turn of a page, but not if you were living it. Malachi said there's a chair. It's going to be filled, and it's going to be great when it's filled. And it was filled. God was faithful with his promise. He promised it would be filled. It was filled. But for those 20 generations that lived between Malachi pointing to the chair and the chair being filled, for those 20 generations, the chair wasn't filled. And it wasn't like there weren't wrongs that desperately needed to be made right in those 400 years. In fact, there were some terrible things that happened in those 400 years. The Holy Land, Israel, was completely occupied by the Greeks for a while. The Greeks came in, took over everything, tried to completely dismantle their culture, their religion, their society, and reform them into Greek people. They then took over the Temple Mount. They slaughtered pigs on God's altar in the temple. They set up a massive 20-foot statue to Zeus in the middle of the temple. They were looking for someone to fill that chair. They're saying, Malachi said it was going to be filled. We could use it now. After the Greeks finally left, the Romans came in and they occupied the Holy Land, and we know all the terrible things that they did to subvert the people. That was a nothing that was something. There were people that were yearning and desperate for God to send this one who would right the wrongs, who would lift every valley and lower every mountain. And yet they had to wait. And so Malachi reminds us of God's faithfulness, that God, 400 years later, God didn't forget his promises. But Malachi also reminds us that God's understanding of time is a little different than our understanding of time. And so Malachi and the time in between Malachi and Jesus is a time of waiting, which is what Advent is all about. Advent is a season of waiting. It's a season of expectation. Like Mary waiting for Jesus to be born from her, like the church waiting for Jesus to come again, we are waiting. The problem is we aren't always very good waiters. We don't wait very well, right? We do this thing in the church called Advent, and we hold off on the decorations, and we hold off on the Christmas music because it's not Christmas, it's Advent. But then you walk out these doors, and it's full-on Christmas, right? Like you walk to the Bridgewater Mall or any other mall, and like Santa's there, and it's like we don't wait very well. I had. Some of you may know I had a friend of mine who's a priest in England. He came to America a couple weeks ago, and I took him around New York City, his first time in the city, and they were starting to get things decorated. And he said that it's good that we have Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving gives us at least a little buffer. He said London, by mid-November, was already full on Christmas. So we have built in a little bit of waiting, but we're not very good at this whole waiting thing. And I don't just mean waiting for Christmas. I mean waiting for the things that are hurting in our life. When we're waiting on God to lift our valleys and lower our mountains, when we're waiting for God to answer our prayers, when we have nothings that are somethings in our lives that weigh on us deeply. And so, how do we wait? So I want to just quickly give three things that I think about when I think about waiting. And the first is, we might be waiting for God to do this specific thing, fill this specific chair. And God may be taking longer than we would like, which is usually the case. But just because we are waiting for this specific thing does not mean that God isn't doing anything. There is 400 years between Malachi promising God would send this person and Jesus being born in Bethlehem. There's 400 years of waiting. But did God do nothing in those 400 years? Was God asleep or on vacation? No. There were millions of things that God did in those 400 years. Millions of ways that God touched people in those 400 years. One of those things, remember I told you about the Greeks who took over the Holy Land and set up the big statue? Well, there was a figure that God raised up out of God's people. His name is Judas Maccabeus, not that Judas, a different Judas. And that Judas raised up an army. And one of the most improbable military victories in world history, Judas's little ragtag group of Jewish soldiers ran the Greek army out of town. One of the most powerful armies the world knew at that point. They expelled them from the Holy Land. Incredible. And then they went to cleanse God's temple and bring it back into use. And after cleaning it up all the pig guts and taking down the idol to Zeus, they then went to light the sanctuary lights, and they went to pour in the oil, and they only had enough oil for one day, and yet the lamps stayed lit for 8 days. This is the story of Hanukkah, which our Jewish friends and neighbors just finished celebrating. In that 400 years, God didn't do that one thing that Malachi said, but God literally lit up the darkness. God literally made a light shine in his land. God may not be doing the one thing we're waiting for, but God is doing other things. Anyone get a chance to see the sunset last night? Oh, the blues, the purples, the pinks, it was brilliant. I was up and saw the sunrise this morning, which was also pretty good. You know, there are people in your life who love you. There are people in your life who would go to bat for you. You get to live this life with people that you love day in and day out. Morning by morning, new mercies we see. There are things that we are waiting for. There are wrongs that we want righted, but there are other things that God is doing. Second thing is that waiting, and particularly when we're desperate, waiting can be incredibly isolating. We can feel like we are utterly alone. But one thing we could remember is that we are not. There are 8 billion people on planet Earth right now. The probability that you are the only one dealing with the problems that you are dealing with is almost zero. If you are sad, there are other people who are sad. If you are anxious, there are other people who are anxious. There is and probably you don't have to go across the world. You could probably just look across the street. You could probably look in the circle of your friends. You are not alone. Being a priest isn't all about being 35 minutes late for meetings. Sometimes and I'm usually not. Sometimes, as a priest, I have to deal with incredibly sad things that break my heart. Sometimes I deal with frustrating things. Sometimes I deal with things that make me angry. And so I have a small group of priests that I have lunch with every 2 weeks. And we come together, and we don't just have lunch, and we sort of make a promise to each other that we are not just going to talk about all the wonderful things going on, but we talk about the things that we're dealing with, the things that are making us sad, the things that are making us frustrated, the things that are making us angry. And each of us talk about those things. And they're not always the same thing, but each of us are dealing with something. We are not alone. you are not alone. And so God is doing things around you. You are not alone. The third thing is to remember this long story, the long story that we read each week. And though we may get stuck on the fact that God moves slower sometimes, oftentimes, than we would like, that God is faithful, that God does not forget about us. When God says that a chair is going to be filled, it may take time, but it will be filled. One of the things the scriptures remind us over and over again is to be faithful. But one of the other things that the scriptures remind us is that God is faithful. That God never forgets us. That God never leaves us. That we are not alone. And so in this season of waiting, in whatever it is that you are waiting for, wait with him. Amen.